everyone. My name is Lindsay Young, and I'm a postdoc scholar at the University of Chicago in the Chicago Center for HIV Elimination, directed by Dr. John Schneider. And today, I want to kind of expand on some topics we've already heard about earlier this morning. So we heard a couple talks on HIV in various parts of the country and the world. And we also heard Nina talk about social norms. And so I kind of want to bring these two things together and talk a little bit about how I am conceptualizing networks as being implicated in the emergence of norms. So as opposed to kind of capture them as perceptions of individuals, I'm trying to move forward in thinking about how we can actually locate within network settings where norms may actually begin to emerge, and thinking about those places as places where we can plan interventions for. So I'm going to talk about how the structure of networks and the communication that occurs within those networks can be studied from an empirical perspective to help us identify these kind of normative pockets. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the background and a little bit of theoretical framework for what motivates my research agenda, talk about the aims, and then I'm going to feature an example study that was published in AIDS and Behavior just in 2018, and then just some next steps. So this is going to be a little bit of a review because we've heard some of this before, but in the United States, really since the mid-90s, we've kind of reached this HIV plateau in the United States. So right now, we kind of hover around about 50,000 new infections per year. But despite this plateau, there's still certain populations that are disproportionately affected. And MSM, men who have sex with men, which we've heard Mariana talk about, is one of the most disproportionately affected populations in the United States, with over 2/3 of new infections in the United States being in this population. Now, if we dig down even further, we find further disparities. So among all HIV diagnosed MSM in 2016, Black MSM accounted for the highest number, followed by Latinos and whites. Within this group, 36% of the HIV diagnoses amongst Black MSM were quite young, aged 13 to 24, and 39% were aged 25 to 34. And then most recently, from 2011 to 2015, the diagnoses among young Black MSM aged 25 to 34 increased 30%. So we see here within MSM, we see both a race and age-based disparity. And so this is why young MSM and young MSM of color have become a point of interest and need for intervention and study and analysis to better understand what makes them vulnerable. So the reasons for these disparities are quite varied and not exactly well understood. So they range from things like low perceptions of their personal risk, limited awareness of their own infection and partner's infection. Certainly amongst young MSM of color, you have stigma and discrimination, both on racial levels and sexual levels, as well as structural vulnerabilities. So like homelessness, incarceration, jail time, socioeconomic disparities, etc. And then you have social network factors, which have become a really kind of popular area of research right now. So things like partner characteristics. Among young Black MSM, there's a lot of age discordant coupling, which plays a factor in their vulnerabilities, as well as things like social norms. And notice what you do not see on this list is simply that Black MSM engage more in risk behaviors than other MSM. This is not the case. In fact, this is found to be the inverse. They tend to actually engage in sexual risk behaviors less than other MSM. So this is all kind of taken together, pointing to the need to better understand the social environments of this population to understand kind of their vulnerabilities. So in 2018, social media has become the rage, and it has been the rage for a while. If you haven't heard of it. Social media really presents some really novel opportunities for behavioral research and intervention among MSM. So first, we have the issue of audience capture. So about 90% of young adults are engaged with social media of some kind, and this number is only increasing. We also know that young LGBT individuals have been found to use social media more than their heterosexual counterparts as a means to kind of meet each other and kind of enter into the community. And missing from these bullet points is also that we know that racial minorities are also heavily engaged in social media. as much as, if not more so than the white community. And then just the way that social media are designed. So they're designed specifically to facilitate communication and social interaction among peers. So it makes it a very obvious context for research about the social lives of young MSM. So the public health response to this awareness that social media exists and that it could become something to be used in research and intervention has typically been to focus on the immediacy of dating applications. So, they're interested in doing kind of behavioral surveillance, but understanding, where risk lies. And so they tend to sample users of various dating applications like Grindr, ask them about their behaviors, ask them about their perceptions of their partner's behaviors, what kinds of, how many partners they found on these sites. But they kind of adopt this very traditional behavioral surveillance approach and kind of just augment it to the social media context. And while this is really helpful in thinking about helping us better understand the characteristics of users of these dating applications, I think they miss something really important, which is where do norms kind of emerge in the first place? And so to this end, my argument is that more general purpose social networking sites like Facebook offer this opportunity to kind of think about, to study kind of normative pathways through which prevention and risk can actually be conferred. And so general purpose social networking sites like Facebook, they have a broader user audience, so it's not just focused on the specific task of meeting a partner, so there's a broader peer base. And we acknowledge that partner seeking does occur on these sites. MSM users have been found in studies to be more likely to use these sites to simply connect with real-world friends. So we can see that there's the potential for actually having a proxy for offline networks, which are more traditionally studied. And so for these reasons, they offer a more natural parallel to the offline peer networks that have been implicated in research for a long time in norm formation and informal social control in the context of adolescent risk behavior. So there's a lot of literature that has kind of studied that at like school levels. And so I think these online social networking sites offer a better mirror to that than some of the dating applications. So as normative incubators, online networking sites, and networks in general, but online networking sites, like their offline counterparts, offer multiple pathways toward norm formation. Specifically in the context of Facebook, you have friendships and group affiliations that represent what I kind of think of as the structural pathways through which peer influence and behavioral reinforcement can occur. And then you have the communication that occurs within those relationships that kind of like the semantic features of interaction that can reveal certain clues about individuals' interests, their norms, their willingness to engage in prevention, risk behaviors, et cetera. So for all of these reasons, this is kind of just the build-up to kind of, this is why I think more research needs to be put into studying these more general purpose social networking sites to better understand norms in these vulnerable populations. And so the aims of this larger research program that I'm trying to develop is to first examine the relationship between prevention and risk behaviors among young Black MSM, that happens to be the population that I focus on, and the structure of their observed social media relationships, so friendships and group affiliations. And here the idea would be to locate pockets of behavioral reinforcement. So I'm specifically interested in how individuals cluster in these networks, individuals who share certain behavioral traits, because it's within those clusterings where norms have the potential to emerge, because there's behavioral reinforcement, there's kind of routinized interaction that occurs, and as we know, norms emerge out of those types of social interactions. The second aspect of this program of research is to then turn to the communication. So we want to characterize the semantic features of their communication on social media and explore that relationship, how those communication patterns relate to prevention and risk behavior. So this is simply meant to establish the link between what people talk about and the actual behaviors that they engage in. And then the third part is kind of coming back around and then examining the relationship between the semantic features of their talk, the way that they talk, and the formation of network ties, again. So then locating pockets of communicative reinforcement. So just for the sake of today's presentation, I'm just going to go through an example study that really just builds on that first aim. So here I'm looking at the relationship between prevention and risk engagement behaviors of young Black MSM and the structure specifically of their group affiliations. So this would be what we call a two-mode network, where we have individuals and Facebook groups. And this is a study that was recently published in Needs and Behavior, along with my co-authors Kaya Fujimoto and John Schneider. So just to give you a sense of the population that I'm looking at, as I've already kind of mentioned, our work at the University of Chicago focuses specifically on young Black MSM living in Chicago. So this was, the study population came from a larger three-wave cohort study called UConnect. And the individuals were aged 18 to 29. The network sample that, so in terms of the analytic sample that I'm focusing on here for this study, it's a sample of 301 of these young Black MSM. The larger cohort is about 600 or so. 269 Facebook groups and a little over 2,200 ties amongst them. So just a note on the Facebook groups. This is just a data note. So when we collected the Facebook data, and I can answer any questions about how we collected the Facebook data. I'm not going into that now. There's been a lot of changes at Facebook. This was done several years ago, so the way that we collected this data no longer exists. But there are other ways that we have other studies that are adopting more of a manual download approach, so there are other ways to collect this data. But when we collected this data, and for those who consented to the Facebook process, there were about a little more than 300 who consented and downloaded their data, and they belonged to over, it was like 4,700 Facebook groups. But 80%, at least 80% of those were like pendants. They had one young Black MSM member to them. So we removed those from the sample. And then we further cut this down to groups that had 4 or more members of the 301 sample who belonged to that group. And we did this for a couple reasons. One was simply a tractability issue, so getting the sample size down to something that was reasonable. 2, we really wanted to focus on Facebook groups that we considered important enough in the population, as opposed to just focusing on a group that has 1 member or maybe 2 members, and we thought 4 was a reasonable cutoff. And 3, we were specifically interested in clustering effects in the network. So we really wanted to focus on the groups that had enough members where you could actually capture some clustering. But again, the results would have to be interpreted in the context of that, and certainly there's some limitations to doing that. As I mentioned, we're interested in the relationship between prevention and risk behaviors of young Black MSM and the structure of their group affiliations. So the attributes that we looked at specifically were SARA status, so HIV positivity. The prevention behaviors that we looked at were regular testing, so whether they had been tested at least twice in the last 9 months. So it was a wave study, and there were 9 months between each wave. And then awareness of PrEP. So PrEP, for those of you who don't know, it stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis, and it's an HIV prevention pill for individuals who are HIV negative. It's taken like birth control once a day. It's a daily regimen, and it's been proven to be upwards of more than 90% effective if taken regularly. So this is really kind of where HIV prevention interventions are really moving towards. And then the sex behaviors that I looked at specifically were condomless sex and group sex in this case. Now, when I get to the type of analysis, you'll see that I can also look at attributes of the groups themselves. So the only real information that we had about the groups specifically were their privacy status. So on Facebook, groups can be labeled as public, closed, or secret. So public groups, anyone can look up the group, you can find it, you can see what's being posted, you can see who's members, you have to ask to join the group, but ultimately it's completely visible to everyone on Facebook. Closed groups have an extra layer of security in that you can search for the group on Facebook and find it. you can see, I think you can see members, but you can't see posts until you've been accepted to the group. And then secret groups are exactly what you would expect. You can't see posts, you can't see members, and you can't actually search for it. So the only way that you can join these groups is if you're invited by an admin. So these are really groups that are completely hidden. And so given that, the way we were interested in whether individuals were more likely to belong to public groups versus closed groups or secret groups, because this will really tell us something about how viable interventions might be in these spaces and our ability as outsiders to potentially intervene and kind of help us think about preferences. If there's preferences for secret groups, then certainly setting up an additional, like an intervention group, like Facebook group, that would probably need to be secret. I mean, in the sense that they're not completely open about talking about HIV or whatnot. Okay, so the methods. So what we used in this analysis is an analytic technique called exponential random graph model. So some of you may have heard of this. We call them ERGMs. Some of you may have not. So I'm going to try to give you a quick rundown of what these do in the simplest way that I can, which sometimes is hard. So essentially what ERGMs do is they model network structure. So you can think of this as a likelihood of a tie being present or absent by accounting for the presence or absence of ties in the network as a function of local configurations or patterns. And we call these local configurations parameters. And so the areas shaded in blue are an example of types of localized patterns that you can parameterize in the model. And so essentially what ERGMs determine is whether ties are more likely to form in the context of these local configurations. So that's how you would kind of interpret the estimate, is whether there's a greater likelihood or a smaller likelihood of a tie being formed in the context of these parameters that you model. Now, these configurations can be endogenous, which means that they emerge from the connections that actors make in response to other ties in the social environment. So here what we have, what the area shaded in blue shows us is basically the tendency for groups that already have lots of members to have, it's the greater likelihood that a person will join that group due to the fact that there are a lot of other individuals that belong to that group. So it's kind of like a venue popularity or a group popularity effect. And this would be how you think about how networks essentially self-organize themselves. And so people are just responding to what other people are doing in the network. But configurations can also emerge from exogenous factors. So in other words, emerging in response to properties that exist outside the network. Specifically, in this case, the attributes of network actors. And so this could be attributes of young black MSM, or this could be attributes of the groups themselves. So again, what you see here is when you would have HIV positive individuals when they tend to cluster around some kind of common set of groups. So in this case, as I alluded to before, since the research question is ultimately how do the prevention and risk behaviors of individuals relate to the formation of ties in the network, I'm primarily interested in these exogenous factors that affect the likelihood of tie formation. So from the modeling perspective, what the parameters that I'm specifically interested in and model are, so the first one is what we call an edge parameter. And this would ultimately, so circles are young black MSM, squares are Facebook groups. And essentially this is asking the question, are young MSM who engage in certain HIV-related behaviors more likely to belong to Facebook groups irrespective of the type of Facebook group? So that's what that little figure is showing. The second type of parameter that was modeled is like an edge interaction parameter. And so this would allow me to answer the question, are young MSM who engage in particular behaviors more likely to belong to certain types of Facebook groups? And as I said, we were interested specifically in groups with different types of privacy status. And then the last part gets to kind of this notion of behavioral clustering that I spoke about before, where we're interested in whether individuals who share common traits, share common HIV-related behaviors, whether they tend to cluster around a common set of Facebook groups. And as I said before, this is kind of where I see the potential for norms to emerge, in the sense that there's it's capturing places where individuals who are similarly motivated or similarly engaged in behaviors, it's the routine interaction around these common set of groups that could form pockets of norms. So to go through our findings, and I tried to kind of distill this as easily as I could. So in terms of whether young Black MSM who engage in certain prevention and risk behaviors, whether they're more likely to belong to Facebook groups, irrespective of the nature of the Facebook group. We find that HIV-positive individuals were more likely to belong to Facebook groups than expected by chance, and individuals who engage in group sex were less likely to belong to Facebook groups than expected. In terms of the interaction effects, we found that HIV-positive individuals, despite being more likely to belong to Facebook groups, were actually less likely to belong to secret groups. And this is all relative to public groups, so in terms of the modeling. Individuals who engaged in group sex, despite being less likely to belong to Facebook groups in general, when they did belong to Facebook groups, they were more likely to belong to secret groups. And we also found that regular testers were more likely to belong to closed groups, so kind of that in-between area relative to public groups. And then finally, in terms of the clustering effects, we found that HIV-positive individuals were actually less likely to share groups in common with other HIV-positive individuals. So we found a significant negative effect of clustering with HIV-positive individuals. And we found that individuals who engaged in condomless sex were more likely to cluster around a shared set of groups. All right, so what does this even all mean? I mean, it's interesting. But how can we think about this from an applied perspective, since most of our research, most of us, I guess, in this room do some aspects of applied research. How can this even be useful for thinking about interventions? So first, just kind of quite simply, determining whether individuals who engage in either prevention or risk-related behaviors, whether they have a greater tendency to belong to Facebook groups, lets us know whether these settings are even present viable places, for engagement with them. Two, establishing the connection between HIV behaviors and group-level privacy tells us how easy or difficult it will be for outsiders to intervene or leverage in these settings for HIV prevention. And third, identifying the relational infrastructure that brings the same individuals together and supports patterns of reinforced behavior and potentially reinforced communication is crucial for locating where norms may emerge in the first place and for thinking about planning prevention messaging, things like that. And I think it's also important to note that it's also important to identify where this kind of clustering is not happening. So I think the finding about HIV-positive individuals being less likely to actually cluster around common groups may be indicative of an opportunity gap that stands to be filled with respect to kind of building group-related settings on Facebook specifically for HIV-positive individuals so that they can obtain that kind of emotional and social support from one another. This is not to say that they're not getting that at all. I mean, there's certainly a lot of other avenues that individuals can take to kind of get that kind of support, but with more and more time being spent on social media, I think from kind of an intervention design perspective, that's an opportunity that needs to be filled. So next steps, obviously, because I laid out what my research agenda was, the next step is to do the same kind of modeling with the Facebook friendship networks, which I am currently working on, and I could have actually put some findings in here, but I just thought it was too much to take, but that's currently being worked on. And then this summer, I'm doing a visiting fellowship with, at USC with their Center for Artificial Intelligence and Society. And there is where I'll be working on characterizing the semantic features of Facebook communication amongst these individuals using machine learning techniques, since it's a massive corpus of data. But the goal is to essentially distill that corpus of data to kind of characterize individuals on the basis of how they talk about certain HIV-related topics and issues. So sex, substance use, health-related things, depression, financial stability, all these factors that are often studied in the context of HIV vulnerabilities, how we can characterize individuals on the extent to which they talk about these issues and try to relate that back to their behaviors as well as to their networking patterns. And yeah, those are the next steps. So like an idiot, I always forget to put the slide that thanks funders and collaborators, but this research is supported by NIH funding. And I can't remember the numbers of the grants, but it is, and so that's it. Thank you.
Comments and questions?
Thank you so much for your
Yeah.
presentation. I'm just curious about in research, how we sometimes can lag a little bit behind the various social media platforms that are emerging. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to your future directions on Facebook versus Grindr or other platforms. Arguably, of course, the communication or the behavior that's happening on those is going to be different.
Yeah.
If you could speak to that.
Yeah, so my future intention is to do just that, is to expand this repertoire of social media and to ultimately have a much more heterogeneous sample of social media data to draw from, but also to be able to then characterize and profile individuals, taking into context all of these different platforms. But that's a hefty, it's a hefty thing to do, and part of the reason why it's hefty is because of access to certain types of data. So, as we all know, Facebook has made it a little bit more difficult. So this data was collected back when you could actually develop third-party apps that could scrape data. But we continue to use Facebook data through more of a manual download approach. So they consent to the download. So everyone can download your Facebook data. One of probably the only thing that Facebook has actually done since the Cambridge Analytics has actually made that process a little bit more transparent, and you can select which data you want. But you have always been able to do that. It just wasn't well known. And then the third part of this, so there's a feasibility issue, access issue. Certainly using things like Twitter, it's public API, so you get a lot of data, but specifically with our population, they're not really using Twitter, that much, and they're not using it for these to have these more peer-related, normative, routine conversations that often still do occur on Facebook. So part of it is just that Facebook offers this really nice, generalized social peer platform where people post, they engage in direct exchanges, but you post on your wall and your friends see that. So it's this public communication, and so in some ways, I like those aspects of Facebook. With Grindr, so as I said, there's plenty of studies out there that, and more coming along the way that look at Grindr. It's almost always Grindr, occasionally Adam for Adam, a couple other websites. From my understanding, getting the real network data behind that, I haven't really seen any studies that have effectively have obtained the raw network data that exists on Grindr. So usually they're doing, as I said, capturing users of Grindr, asking them a bunch of questions about their own behaviors, the partners that they may have met on Grindr. I think there've been some studies of profiles, so there's more of a qualitative, or not even necessarily qualitative, but have tried to identify statuses that they use and relating that to certain things. But as someone who's interested in the actual networked architecture of those places, so far I'm not sure I can do that with Grindr. Of course, I'm always open. Anyone who has any ideas about that or how to get access to that data, I would be interested in hearing about that. But your point is taken. There's a lot of other social media applications. And specifically for the population that I study, we just know that Facebook is still the most popular social media platform for them. More and more, yes, are using Snapchat. They're on Instagram. But they're still burgeoning, and they just still don't quite have the kind of the imprint on the social lives of these individuals than Facebook does. So, yeah, you know.
Lindsay, that was great. I was just curious about like what is the nature of the closed groups? Like what sort of things are they sharing, and
Yeah.
what did you think about that association between group sex and closed groups? Like what does that mean?
Yeah. So another study that I'm working on is taking this part of this data set, and it's about a data set of about 600 of these groups that I've coded for kind of topics. So just had some RAs, and it's taken a little time. So we finally got that finished. So I'm hoping to actually start analyzing that data. So looking at what these groups are about and how that relates to these things. I can tell you anecdotally, just from having done a lot of this coding, that public groups are the gamut. So they range from just kind of generic chat groups to special interest, kind of recreational interest groups, you know, to LGBT identity kind of out and proud advocacy kind of groups, to what I would call like, you know, cruising or sex or attraction groups. You know, they range. The more private you get, the more that they tend to be specifically about, you know, sexual attraction. So yeah, the sex and cruising sites. More about LGBTQ identity. Kind of the things that, having studied these populations, that you would suspect. So the more secret they become, the more specifically they become about sex, sexual identity, sexual orientation, and LGBTQ identity. But that's not to say that those also don't exist in public Facebook groups. So I think that's how we interpreted that finding about those who engage in group sex, is that they are engaging in a behavior that even in the MSM population is often stigmatized and kind of thought of as like, you're dirty, you know. So, which I'm not saying is fair, but that it exists. There's a stigma around that. And so those individuals may be less likely to want to kind of air that, obviously. And, you know, further research would have to be done to see whether that phenomena of those who engage in group sex belonging to secret groups, if the fact that maybe they identify as bisexual or down low or something like that, if that kind of interacts with that. Because that would give us more of an idea of whether they really are, like the extent to which they're out, to which they disclose to kind of family and friends and whatnot. And that's a real phenomena in the African-American MSM population, is this kind of, I wouldn't say hiding identity, but kind of having multiple, like a more gradient identity structure, you know, and at different levels of kind of being out in the traditional sense that we think about it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.